The alarm on my wrist console screamed before I even opened my eyes. Red light filled my quarters aboard the station. I sat up fast, my heart already pounding, because that alarm only meant one thing. Something had happened to one of our colonies again. My name is Elias Voss, and at the time, I served as an aide to the human delegation on the Galactic Council. I had spent 6 years watching my people bow their heads in rooms full of aliens who thought we were dangerous children who needed to be watched every second. That morning, I did not know it yet, but everything was about to change forever. I ran through the corridor, past windows that looked out over a sea of stars, and I reached the communication hub where Commander Grace Whitfield stood with her arms crossed, staring at a screen. Her face told me everything before she spoke a single word. "Kestrel Colony," she said quietly, "gone dark 3 hours ago." Kestrel was a farming settlement, 12,000 people, families who had left Earth to build a quiet life among the stars, far from old conflicts and old fears. They grew wheat under 3 suns and sent grain shipments to half a dozen struggling worlds. They had no weapons beyond basic defense grids. They were never supposed to be a target. Who did this? I asked, though somewhere inside me, I already knew the answer. Grace turned the screen toward me. Ships, sleek, curved hulls painted in deep violet, moving away from the wreckage of our colony's orbital platform. The emblem on their hulls was unmistakable, the Dravani Dominion. The Dravani had been a thorn in humanity's side for over a decade. They were an old species, proud and ancient, with fleets that had crushed smaller civilizations long before humans ever learned to leave our own solar system. They believed strength gave them the right to take whatever they wanted from those weaker than them, and for years, the Galactic Council had done nothing to stop them from testing that belief against us. "There will be a hearing," Grace said, though her voice had no comfort in it. "There is always a hearing." I clenched my jaw. A hearing. Words spoken in a marble chamber, while our people lay buried under broken buildings. We boarded a transport within the hour, heading toward the council station, a massive ring of metal and light that orbited a neutral star system where representatives from over 40 species gathered to decide the fate of the galaxy. As our ship approached, I looked out at that shining ring and felt something twist in my stomach. It looked beautiful from a distance. Up close, it was nothing but a room full of judges who had never once ruled fully in our favor. Inside the main chamber, the air smelled of strange incense burned by one of the older species who believed it calmed tempers before debate. Rows of seats rose in circular tiers, each one holding a different alien delegation. The Velkari, tall and silver-skinned, sat closest to the center, since they held the most influence on the council. The Orsoon, broad and slow-moving, murmured to each other in low tones, and near the back, in seats that were clearly meant to remind us of our place, sat the human delegation. I found my seat beside Ambassador Margaret Hale, the woman who had represented humanity for almost a decade. She was in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back tightly, and eyes that had seen far too many of these hearings to still believe in them. Yet she always walked in with her back straight and her voice steady, because someone had to. "They will not act," she whispered to me as the session began. "You know this." I did know it. I had seen it happen before. A colony attacked, our representatives standing to demand justice, and then weeks of debate that always ended the same way. The council would express deep sorrow. They would offer resources for rebuilding. They would remind us that violence only breeds more violence, and that humanity must show patience and restraint if we wish to be seen as a mature species worthy of full standing among the stars. The Velkari speaker rose first, a being named Serena Vale, who had negotiated countless treaties in her long life. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, as she addressed the chamber. "We have reviewed the reports from Kestrel Colony," she said. "The loss of life is a tragedy, and the Council extends its deepest condolences to the human delegation." Margaret stood immediately. "Condolences will not bring back 12,000 of our people. We need action. The Dravani have attacked 6 of our colonies in the last 4 years. Every time, this council calls it a tragedy and does nothing more." Serena's expression did not change. The evidence linking this attack directly to Dravani forces is still under review. The ships were photographed leaving the scene, Margaret said, her voice sharpening. Their emblem was clearly visible. Emblems can be falsified, Serena replied. We must be careful not to escalate tensions based on incomplete information. Humanity has a history of reacting strongly to provocation. We ask for patience while a full investigation is conducted. I felt my hands tighten into fists under the table. A history of reacting strongly. That was the phrase they always used, as if humanity's ancient wars, fought thousands of years ago on a single small planet, somehow proved that we could never be trusted to defend ourselves properly now. A representative of the Dravani Dominion sat near the far side of the chamber, a tall figure with skin like dark stone and eyes that glowed faint amber. His name was Kaeth Dural, and he had the calm posture of someone who knew he would face no real consequences. The human delegation continues to make accusations without proof, Kaeth said smoothly. We understand grief clouds judgment. Perhaps humanity should consider whether their own aggressive expansion into contested space invited this unfortunate incident. The chamber murmured. Some of the delegations actually nodded along with his words, as though it made perfect sense that a farming colony growing wheat under 3 suns had somehow invited its own destruction. I looked at Margaret. Her hands were shaking slightly, though her voice remained level. Kestrel colony existed for 11 years, she said. It sat inside recognized human territory, verified and registered with this very council. There is no contested space. There is only an attack on innocent civilians, and a council that refuses to call it what it is. Serena raised a hand gently, the universal gesture the Velkari used to signal the end of a debate before a vote. The matter will be referred to the Committee for Interspecies Conflict Resolution for further study. A report will be issued within the standard review period. The standard review period was 8 months. I had seen this before. By the time any report was issued, the story would be old news, and no meaningful action would ever follow. I watched Kaeth Dural's face as the vote was called, and I saw something there that made my blood run cold. Not fear, not even mild concern, just quiet satisfaction, the look of a predator who understood exactly how the system worked, and how to use it against us again and again. The vote passed, no sanctions, no formal condemnation, just another hearing, another postponement, another 12,000 names added to a list that seemed to grow longer every single year. We left the chamber in silence. Margaret did not speak until we reached the transport bay, and when she finally did, her voice was quiet in a way I had never heard before. I have sat in that chamber for 9 years, Elias, she said. I have watched them protect every species except ours. I used to believe that if we simply proved ourselves patient enough, reasonable enough, peaceful enough, they would finally treat us as equals. And now? I asked. She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something other than exhaustion in her eyes. I saw the beginning of something sharper. Now I wonder what it would take for them to actually fear losing our trust, she said, because right now they do not fear losing anything from us at all. We boarded the transport back toward human space, and I sat by the window, watching the council station shrink behind us. I thought about Kestrel Colony, about families who had done nothing wrong except try to build a peaceful life, far from old conflicts. I thought about the amber glow in Kaeth Dural's eyes, and the quiet certainty that he would never be punished for what his people had done. Somewhere on Earth and across 100 human colonies, word of the hearing's outcome was already spreading. I did not know it then, but leaders across our entire species were beginning to ask themselves the same question Margaret had just asked me. How much more would we absorb before we stopped asking for permission to protect our own people? I did not know that within days, I would sit in a room far more important than that council chamber, listening to humanity's most respected voices decide something that would shake the entire galaxy to its core. I did not know that the era of patience was ending, and that history would later mark this exact moment as the beginning of it all. But as our ship pulled away from that shining ring of marble and light, I felt it already. A shift, quiet, but absolute, moving through every human heart that had just watched justice denied one time too many. Peace had been our choice for a very long time. I was about to learn that a choice can be unmade. The transport carried us home in silence, and somewhere beneath that silence, I could feel something ancient stirring within my own people. Not anger alone, though anger was there. Something colder, something patient in a different way than before. The kind of patience that waits not to forgive, but to prepare. I did not sleep during that journey. I stared out at the stars and wondered how many more kestrel colonies it would take, how many more hearings, how many more amber-eyed representatives smiling quietly while our people buried their dead. I wondered if this time, finally, would be the last time we simply accepted the answer we were given. When we landed at the human capital station, Margaret placed a hand on my shoulder before we disembarked. "Rest if you can," she said. "Tomorrow, everything changes." I did not fully understand what she meant, not yet, but I would soon enough. Humanity had spent decades proving it could be gentle. We were about to show the galaxy what happened when gentleness finally ran out. The meeting room was buried 3 levels beneath the surface of the human capital station, in a chamber built with walls thick enough to stop any signal from leaving or entering without authorization. I had never been inside this room before. Few people had. When Margaret told me to follow her through the final checkpoint, I understood that whatever happened here would not be forgotten. 22 people sat around a long table when we entered. Military leaders, planetary governors, senior scientists, and representatives from every major human settlement across known space. I recognized many of their faces from broadcasts and reports, but seeing them all together in one room, tired and grim, made the moment feel heavier than anything I had experienced before. At the head of the table sat a woman named Eleanor Finch, the elected coordinator of the Unified Human Assembly. She was not young, and her hair had gone fully gray years earlier, but her presence filled the room the moment she began to speak. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," she said. "I will not waste time with formalities. You have all seen the Council's decision regarding Kestrel Colony. I want to hear from each of you honestly. Where do we stand?" A man near the far end of the table stood first. His name was Daniel Cole, a fleet admiral who had spent 30 years defending human border colonies with a force that was always kept deliberately smaller than what our shipyards could actually produce, because the Council capped our military expansion under the excuse of maintaining regional balance. "We stand exactly where we have stood for a decade," Daniel said, "watching our people die while the Council debates definitions. I have buried friends because we were told to wait for approval before responding to attacks already in progress. I am done waiting." Murmurs of agreement passed around the table. Eleanor raised a hand, and the room quieted. "Being done waiting is easy to say," she said. "It is another thing to act on it. If we break from Council protocols, we lose every trade agreement, every technology sharing arrangement, and any protection those agreements provide. We would be standing entirely alone against species who have fleets far older than ours." A woman named Charlotte Vane spoke next. She led the scientific council responsible for weapons research, though her division had always operated under strict council oversight, limiting what technology humanity was permitted to develop. "With respect, Coordinator, those protections have never actually protected us," Charlotte said. "Every treaty we have signed limits our defenses while placing no real limits on species like the Dravani. We have been allowed just enough strength to survive, never enough to truly defend ourselves. I believe that limitation was intentional." The room fell silent at that. Eleanor looked at her carefully. "Explain," she said. Charlotte stood and activated a display at the center of the table, projecting a series of charts showing decades of Council policy toward humanity, compared to their treatment of other species. When the Velkari joined the Council, they were permitted full military autonomy within 5 years, Charlotte said. The Orsun received similar treatment. Humanity has been under supervised restriction for 23 years, with no path toward full autonomy ever clearly defined. Every time we ask when these restrictions will end, We are told more time is needed to demonstrate our peaceful intentions. They are afraid of us, Daniel said quietly. I believe they always have been, Charlotte replied. Our historical records fascinate them and frighten them in equal measure. Species that reached the stars peacefully from the beginning cannot fully understand a species that clawed its way out of centuries of conflict and still managed to build something greater afterward. They do not see us as children who need protecting. I think they see us as something that has not yet fully woken up, and they are terrified of what happens when we do. I sat quietly through most of this, listening, until Margaret finally turned to me. Elias was in the chamber during the Kestrel hearing, she said. Tell them what you saw. I stood, feeling every eye in the room settle on me. I described the calm satisfaction on Keith Durrell's face. I described the quiet dismissal of our evidence, the endless procedural delays, the standard review period that would take 8 months to produce nothing. When I finished, the room sat in heavy silence. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, studying the faces around the table before she spoke again. I have led this assembly for 11 years, she said. In that time, I have negotiated for peace at every possible opportunity, because I believed peace was worth almost any sacrifice. I still believe peace is valuable. But I no longer believe the Council's version of peace serves us. Their peace asks only humanity to bleed quietly while they debate whether our wounds are real. A younger governor near the middle of the table, a man named Nathaniel Cross who oversaw several outer colonies, spoke up with visible frustration. My constituents ask me every single day why we cannot properly defend our own borders, he said. I have run out of answers that satisfy them, because the truth is, we cannot defend our own borders, not fully, because the Council will not allow it. What exactly are you all proposing? Eleanor asked, looking around the table. Daniel Cole answered first. Full withdrawal from the Council's peace accords. Not a declaration of war. We are not seeking conquest, but we stop asking permission before defending our people. We stop capping our fleet production at Council-mandated levels. We build what we need to protect what is ours, and we respond to attacks the moment they happen, not 8 months later. That will be seen as an act of aggression, Eleanor said. It will be seen as exactly what it is, Charlotte replied. A species finally refusing to remain defenseless. The debate continued for hours after that. Some voices in the room urged caution, warning that stepping outside Council protection could invite attacks from multiple species at once, not only the Dravani. Others argued that continuing to wait for Council approval had already cost far more lives than any risk of stepping away ever could. I listened to every argument, watching Eleanor's face carefully, trying to read which way she was leaning. It was Margaret who eventually rose and delivered the words I would remember for the rest of my life. I have spent my entire career believing that patience was our greatest strength, she said. I told myself that if we simply endured long enough, proved ourselves calm and reasonable long enough, the Council would eventually grant us the respect we deserved. I was wrong. Patience was never taught to us by anyone. We taught it to ourselves out of necessity, because we knew what our history looked like, and we were terrified of repeating it in front of an audience that already believed the worst of us. She paused, looking around the table slowly. But patience without a limit is not virtue, she continued. It is submission. We have been patient while our colonies burned. We have been patient while our evidence was dismissed. We have been patient while species far younger to the stars than the Dravani were granted freedoms denied to us for over 2 decades. I say we stop being patient today, not because we have become violent, because we have finally remembered that peace was always our choice to give, and it can be a choice we take back. The room was silent after she finished speaking. Eleanor sat with her hands folded on the table for a long moment before she finally looked up. If we do this, she said, there is no path back to what we were. The Council will see this as a threat, regardless of how carefully we word it. Other species may see it as an opportunity to strike before we grow stronger. We would be choosing to stand entirely on our own, for the first time since we left our solar system. We have always stood on our own, Daniel said. We simply pretended otherwise to keep the peace. Eleanor looked around the table one final time, meeting the eyes of every person present. Then she nodded slowly. "Prepare the formal notice," she said. "We are withdrawing from the Council Peace Accords, effective immediately. We are not declaring war on any species. We are declaring that humanity will no longer wait for permission to protect its own people." A quiet murmur passed through the room, not celebration, but something heavier. Resolve. I felt it settle into my own chest as well, a strange mixture of fear and relief, as though a weight I had carried since the day I first entered that council chamber had finally been set down. Charlotte began preparing the technical language for the formal announcement. Daniel called for his senior officers to begin drafting new fleet production schedules, no longer limited by council-mandated caps. Nathaniel contacted his outer colony governors to inform them that additional defense resources would soon be authorized. The room, which had felt so heavy with dread only hours earlier, now moved with a quiet, focused energy that I had never witnessed before. Margaret found me near the door as the meeting began to break apart into smaller groups of planning and preparation. "You look uncertain," she said. "I am uncertain," I admitted. "This changes everything. I do not know what comes next." "Neither do I," she said. "But I know what came before was not working. Sometimes the only way to discover whether you can stand on your own is to stop leaning on something that was never truly holding you up in the first place." I thought about Kestrel Colony again, about the families who had simply wanted to grow wheat under 3 suns in peace. I thought about how many more colonies might have shared their fate if this meeting had ended differently. Later that night, the formal notice was transmitted to the Galactic Council. I stood in the communication hub alongside Margaret and Eleanor as the message went out across the stars, informing every species in Council space that humanity was stepping away from the peace accords that had bound us for over 2 decades. It was a short message, carefully worded, free of threats or demands. It simply stated that humanity would begin fully defending its own territory according to its own judgment, without seeking prior council approval for any defensive action taken against attacks on human colonies or citizens. Eleanor read the final draft one last time before authorizing its transmission. Her hand hovered over the console for a long moment. "Once this is sent," she said quietly, "there is no calling it back." "There was never really a version of this where we called it back," Margaret said. "Not after Kestrel, not after everything before it." Eleanor nodded once and pressed the transmission key. The message left our station and began its journey across the vast distances of space, toward every corner of Council territory, toward the ears of every ambassador and every fleet commander who had grown used to seeing humanity as something small and easily managed. I did not know it in that moment, but somewhere far across those distances, in the marble chamber of the Council station, alarms were already beginning to sound. The message reached the Council station at what its calendar marked as the middle of the night cycle, though the chamber never truly slept. Within minutes of its arrival, every senior delegate had been woken and summoned to an emergency session. I learned the details of what happened there only later, pieced together from recordings and testimony given by staff members who witnessed it firsthand, but the picture they described has stayed with me ever since. Serena Vale, the Velkari speaker who had so calmly dismissed our evidence during the Kestrel hearing, stood at the center of the chamber, reading the human transmission for the 3rd time, as though repetition might change its meaning. Around her, delegates from a dozen species spoke over one another in a chaos of raised voices and translated static. "This is not a formal declaration of war," said a council legal advisor, trying to bring order to the room. "The language is precise. Humanity states only that they will act in their own defense, without prior council approval." "That is precisely the problem," Serena said, her calm voice finally cracking under strain. "Do you understand what that means, coming from them specifically?" Few in the chamber did understand, not truly, not the way the older archivists did, but one being present that night grasped the weight of it immediately. His name was Vesik Thane, an ancient historian of the Orsoon species who had spent nearly 2 centuries studying the recorded conflicts of every species admitted to Council space. He rose from his seat, and the chamber quieted, out of respect for his age and knowledge. "I have read every file humanity submitted upon joining this council," Vesic said. "Files on their own history, offered freely, without our demand. Do you know why they offered them so freely?" No one answered. "Because they wanted us to be afraid from the very beginning," Vesic said, "and we were too arrogant to listen properly. We read those files and saw only barbarism, a species that fought itself for thousands of years before finally reaching the stars. We congratulated ourselves for taming them, for placing limits on their fleets, for teaching them the value of council oversight. We never once considered that we were reading the history of a species that learns from every conflict it survives and improves each time, and that we had simply been watching the early chapters." "You are suggesting they have been holding back," said another delegate, a broad-shouldered Orsian representative near the front row. "I am certain of it," Vesic said. "Consider the numbers. Humanity's fleet, even under our restrictions, has grown more efficient every single year, despite the caps we placed on their production. Their engineers request the bare minimum of resources and somehow produce results equal to species given triple the allowance. Their military doctrine, even in limited training exercises we have observed, adapts faster than any other species we have on record. We assumed this was simply talent. I now believe it was restraint, carefully measured, because they knew that showing their true capability too early would only tighten the restrictions further." Serena's composure had fully broken by this point. She sat down heavily in her chair, staring at the transmission still displayed above the chamber floor. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "Now," Vesic said, "we discover what happens when a species that has spent its entire history learning how to survive against overwhelming odds decides it no longer needs our permission to do so." Word of the emergency session spread quickly through council space, and within days, delegations from nearly every member species requested private meetings to discuss the human situation. Some sought reassurance, others sought advantage. The Dravani Dominion, predictably, sought neither. Kayeth Durrell addressed a smaller gathering of allied species leaders in a private chamber, one that Margaret later gained access to through contacts sympathetic to humanity's position. His tone, according to those records, remained dismissive throughout. "They are posturing," Kayeth said. "A species that has spent decades asking politely for permission does not suddenly become dangerous overnight, simply because they stopped asking. This is theater, meant to frighten smaller delegations into supporting their cause. I say we test their resolve directly. If they truly intend to defend themselves without restriction, let them prove it against a target that matters." One of his advisors, a younger Dravani officer, raised a hesitant concern. The Orsun historian's warning was detailed. Perhaps caution would serve us better than provocation. Kayeth waved the concern aside. "Vesic is old and afraid of shadows. Humanity has shown us restraint for over 2 decades. Restraint is a habit, not a mask. I do not believe a species can simply discard decades of behavior in a single announcement. We will proceed as planned against their border settlements near the Halvorn corridor. If they respond with genuine force, we will know the truth. If they respond as they always have, with delay and diplomatic complaint, we will know their announcement was empty." I learned of this exchange weeks later, and even with the distance of time, reading the transcript still made my chest tighten with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Kayeth Durrell had been given every opportunity to understand what Vesic Thane already suspected, and he chose instead to gamble the lives of his own people on the assumption that humanity's patience was simply a fixed part of our character rather than a choice we had finally decided to abandon. Meanwhile, on the council floor, the mood shifted from confusion toward something closer to genuine anxiety. Several smaller species, ones who had long depended on council mediation to protect them from larger powers, began quietly reaching out to human representatives through unofficial channels, hoping to secure goodwill before any conflict escalated further. Margaret received several of these approaches personally, and she handled each one carefully, aware that humanity's actions in the coming days would shape how every species in council space viewed us for generations to come. They are afraid, she told me, after one such meeting with a delegation from a smaller agricultural species that had suffered under Dravani pressure for years without any real council intervention. Not just of what we might do to the Dravani. They are afraid of what it means that the council allowed things to reach this point in the first place. If we could be pushed this far, what does that say about the protection the rest of them believe they have? The council, for its part, attempted a final diplomatic maneuver before the situation escalated further. A formal delegation, led by Serena Vale herself, requested an emergency meeting with Eleanor Finch, hoping to negotiate a return to the previous accords under revised terms. I attended that meeting as part of the human delegation's support staff, standing quietly near the back of the room as Serena made her case. "We understand humanity's frustration," Serena said, her voice carefully measured despite the tension clearly present beneath it. "We are prepared to discuss expedited review processes for future incidents and increased autonomy regarding border defense measures. We ask only that you reconsider full withdrawal from the accords while these revised terms are formalized." Eleanor listened patiently before responding, her tone calm but firm. "Ambassador Vale, I appreciate that you have come here directly rather than sending further written statements," she said. "But I must ask you honestly, if Kestrel Colony had not been the 6th attack in 4 years, if it had been the first, would this council be offering these revised terms today?" Serena did not answer immediately, and her silence spoke clearly enough. "We are not interested in punishing the council," Eleanor continued. "We are not seeking to abandon cooperation entirely. Trade will continue, diplomatic relations will continue, but the specific accords that required us to seek approval before defending our own people, those accords are finished. That decision will not be reversed, regardless of what revised terms are offered now." Serena left that meeting without the outcome she had hoped for, and within hours, reports began circulating that Dravani forces were mobilizing near the Halvorn Corridor, a border region containing several smaller human settlements that had long sat uncomfortably close to Dravani-controlled space. I remember standing in the communication hub when the first alert came through, watching Daniel Cole's expression harden as he read the incoming fleet movement data. "They are testing us," he said quietly, "exactly as we expected they might." "What do we do?" I asked. Daniel looked up at me, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw something in his eyes that was not weariness or frustration, but a kind of grim readiness that I had never witnessed in any human military leader during my years serving in the delegation. "We defend our people. No delay, no request for approval, no waiting 8 months for a report that changes nothing." Word spread quickly through the Fleet Command network, and within hours, ships that had sat under strict council-mandated limitations for over 2 decades began moving toward the Halvorn Corridor at full capacity for the very first time. I watched the deployment reports scroll across the display, ship after ship, each one representing years of restrained production finally being put to its intended purpose. Margaret stood beside me as the fleet moved into position, her face unreadable. "Do you think they truly believed we were bluffing?" I asked her. "I think Kaeth Durrell believed exactly what he wanted to believe," she said. "Powerful beings often do. They mistake patience for weakness, because weakness is easier to understand than restraint. He is about to learn the difference firsthand." Far across the stars, in the marble chamber of the council station, Vesic Thane sat alone long after the emergency session had ended, reviewing humanity's historical files once more. According to those who saw him that night, he simply stared at the data for hours, occasionally shaking his head slowly, as though confirming something he had feared from the very beginning. The Council had spent over 2 decades believing they understood humanity completely, catalogued and measured and safely contained within careful restrictions. They were about to discover exactly how much they had never actually seen. I was granted a place aboard the fleet flagship as part of the delegation's observation team, a decision Margaret fought hard to secure because she believed the assembly needed a first-hand account of whatever was about to happen, not just sensor readings and tactical summaries. I had never served in a combat capacity before, and standing on the bridge of that ship as it approached the Halvorn corridor, I felt a fear unlike anything I had experienced during my years of diplomatic service. The flagship was called the Meridian, and its commanding officer was Daniel Cole himself, who had requested direct command of this operation, rather than delegating it to a subordinate. He stood at the center of the bridge, calm and focused, studying the tactical display that showed Dravani forces gathered near the border settlements of the corridor. "Confirm settlement status," Daniel said to his communications officer, a young woman named Laura Bennett, who had served under him for nearly 5 years. "All 3 settlements report Dravani ships holding position at the outer boundary," Laura said. "No direct engagement yet. They appear to be waiting." "Waiting for us," Daniel said quietly. "Let us not disappoint them." The Meridian led a formation of 42 ships toward the corridor, a number that would have seemed impossible only weeks earlier, under the old Council-mandated production caps. I watched the tactical display update as our fleet approached, and I noticed something remarkable in the way our ships moved together, a level of coordination that felt almost effortless compared to the rigid, cautious maneuvers I had witnessed during previous limited engagements against Dravani raiders. "Admiral, Dravani forces are repositioning," Laura reported. "They appear to be forming a standard engagement pattern, consistent with previous encounters." Daniel studied the display for a moment before responding. "They are still fighting the war they think they know. Helm, adjust course according to the adaptive formation protocol we drilled last month." I did not fully understand what that meant until I watched it unfold. Rather than approaching in the straight, predictable lines that Dravani commanders had grown accustomed to seeing from human fleets during previous limited skirmishes, our ships split into smaller, flexible groups, adjusting their positions continuously based on real-time data rather than following a fixed battle plan. It was a style of engagement built entirely around adaptation rather than rigid strategy, something the older species in Council space, bound by centuries of ritualized and rule-bound conflict, had simply never learned to counter. The Dravani commander leading the border force, a battle-hardened officer named Voron Ket, broadcast an open-channel message as our fleet drew closer, clearly expecting the same cautious, defensive posture humanity had always shown in previous encounters. "Human fleet, you have entered contested space in violation of established boundaries," Voron's voice came through, translated into clear, measured English. "Withdraw immediately, and this matter may still be resolved through Council mediation." Daniel answered without hesitation. "This is human border territory, verified and registered decades ago. Your forces are the ones in violation. We are not withdrawing, and we are no longer requesting Council mediation for matters of our own defense. Stand down and return to Dravani space, and no further action will be taken." Voron's response came laced with the same dismissive confidence Kf Dural had shown during that private meeting weeks earlier. "You forget your place, human. This is not your first encounter with our forces. You know how these engagements typically conclude." "This one will conclude differently," Daniel said simply, and closed the channel. What followed unfolded faster than I expected, and I found myself gripping the edge of a console as the tactical display filled with rapidly shifting positions and status updates. I want to describe what I witnessed carefully, because it was unlike anything I had read about in any historical account of previous conflicts between species in Council space. The Dravani engaged using their traditional approach, a slow, methodical advance meant to demonstrate strength and force an opponent into a defensive posture before delivering a decisive strike, a style of conflict that had worked effectively against nearly every species they had encountered for centuries. Our fleet, however, did not hold a defensive posture at all. Instead, smaller groups of human ships began executing rapid, coordinated maneuvers that seemed almost unpredictable from the outside, striking at gaps in the Dravani formation before withdrawing just as quickly, forcing Voron's forces to constantly reposition in response. "They are adapting faster than the Dravani can react," Laura said, watching the display with something between awe and disbelief. "Admiral, their formation is beginning to fracture." Daniel nodded, watching calmly. This is exactly what we trained for. Continue the pattern. Do not allow them to stabilize their positions. I realized, watching this unfold, that I was witnessing something the council delegates back in that marble chamber had never truly understood about humanity. Every species in council space had developed their military doctrines through centuries of relatively stable, rule-bound engagements, following patterns that rarely changed because they rarely needed to. Humanity's history had been different. Our conflicts had never followed clean, predictable patterns, and as a result, our approach to strategy had been forged around constant adaptation, around learning from every mistake and adjusting immediately rather than relying on tradition. Within 2 hours, Voron's forces had been pushed back from the border settlements entirely, their formation broken into scattered, disorganized groups struggling to maintain communication with one another. Daniel gave the order to hold position rather than pursue further into Dravani territory, a decision that surprised me given how thoroughly our fleet had gained the advantage. "Why stop here?" I asked him quietly, once the immediate engagement had settled. "Because our goal was never conquest," Daniel said. "Our goal was to prove that we would defend our own people without waiting for permission. We have done that. Pursuing further would confirm every fear the Council holds about what happens once we stop restraining ourselves. I intend to prove those fears wrong, even as I prove our strength beyond question." The border settlements remained secure, and within days, reports of the engagement spread quickly through Council space, carried by traders, diplomats, and independent observers who had witnessed the encounter from nearby systems. The details varied slightly with each retelling, but the core outcome remained consistent every time. Humanity had faced Dravani forces directly, without Council approval, without hesitation, and had won decisively within hours, a result that stunned military analysts across nearly every species represented in the Council chamber. Keth Doral, according to reports later gathered by Margaret's contacts, reacted to the news with initial disbelief, followed by something closer to genuine alarm once the full tactical reports reached Dravani command. Voron Ket's forces had not simply been defeated, they had been outmaneuvered so completely that Dravani strategists struggled to explain exactly how it had happened using their own established military theory. I remember sitting in the Meridian's observation deck that evening, watching the stars outside the viewport, feeling a strange mixture of relief and unease settle over me. We had won. Our people were safe, at least for now, yet I could not fully shake the weight of what this victory represented. Margaret found me there, having arrived aboard a support vessel shortly after the engagement concluded, to begin coordinating the diplomatic response that would inevitably follow. "You look troubled for someone whose side just won," she said, sitting beside me. "I am troubled," I admitted. "Not because we lost anything today, because I finally understand what Vesic Thane meant, the warning about what we had been holding back. Watching that fleet move today, watching how quickly and completely we adapted, I understood that this was still restrained compared to what we are truly capable of, and that thought frightens me almost as much as it reassures me." Margaret was quiet for a long moment before responding. "I understand that feeling. I have felt it myself since the moment we transmitted that withdrawal notice. We have spent so long being told what we were, a violent species that needed to be managed and contained, that we forgot to ask ourselves what we might become once we were finally allowed to simply be what we are, without apology and without restriction." "And what are we?" I asked quietly. "I do not fully know yet," she said, "but I know we are not the species the Council believed they had tamed. I think today proved that beyond any doubt." News of the engagement reached the Council station within hours, and I later learned that an emergency session was called immediately, one even more chaotic than the session that had followed our initial withdrawal announcement. Serena Vale reportedly sat through most of that session in stunned silence, while Vesic Thane, according to those present, simply nodded slowly, as though the outcome confirmed exactly what he had feared from the beginning. Keth Doral did not attend that particular session, having remained at Dravani command to coordinate a response to the unexpected defeat. But representatives from several smaller species reportedly used the opportunity to formally request renewed negotiations with humanity, hoping to secure favorable relations before any further conflicts reshaped the balance of power across council space entirely. The border settlements along the Halvorn corridor held a small memorial gathering 3 days later, honoring the defenders who had given their lives during the brief but intense engagement. I attended alongside Daniel and Margaret, standing quietly among colonists who, for the first time in years, no longer looked toward the sky with quiet dread whenever unfamiliar ships appeared on their sensors. An elderly settler named Henry Pruitt approached us after the gathering, his eyes tired but grateful. "My family has lived on this border for 15 years, he said. "Every year, we wondered if this would be the year we finally lost everything. For the first time, I do not feel that fear anymore." Daniel placed a hand on the older man's shoulder. "That is exactly what we intended to accomplish. Not conquest, simply the right to protect what is ours, without asking permission first." As we returned to the Meridian that evening, I found myself reflecting on everything that had unfolded since that first alarm woke me in my quarters weeks earlier. Kestrel Colony, the emergency assembly meeting, the formal withdrawal from council accords, and now, this decisive victory along a border that had suffered under constant threat for years without any meaningful protection. I understood, standing on that bridge and watching the stars stretch out before us, that humanity had crossed a threshold that could never be uncrossed. We were no longer the cautious, restrained species that had spent decades asking politely for permission to exist safely among the stars. We had become something else entirely, something the Council was only now beginning to truly understand, and something the Dravani Dominion would soon come to regret having so carelessly provoked. 6 months passed after the engagement at the Halvorn corridor, and in that time, the shape of the entire galaxy seemed to shift around us, slowly but unmistakably. I returned to my duties within the human delegation, though the atmosphere surrounding our presence at the council station had changed so completely that I sometimes found it difficult to recognize the same institution I had walked into on the day of the Kestrel hearing. The council convened a formal session to address what they called the matter of human status within the collective, though everyone present understood the true purpose of the gathering. This was not a discussion about punishing humanity for stepping outside the peace accords. It was a negotiation over how the Council would now treat a species they could no longer afford to underestimate. I sat beside Margaret in the chamber, though our seats had been moved, no longer positioned near the back rows reserved for junior delegations, but closer to the center, among the representatives of species considered to hold genuine influence over Council affairs. It was a small change in physical placement, yet it carried enormous symbolic weight, and I noticed several delegates from smaller species watching us with expressions I had never seen directed toward humanity before. Not pity, not condescension, something closer to careful respect, tinged with lingering uncertainty. Serena Vale opened the session, though her tone had shifted considerably from the calm, faintly dismissive manner she had used during previous encounters with our delegation. The Council recognizes the recent events along the Halvorn corridor and the broader implications of humanity's withdrawal from the previous peace accords, she said. We have spent considerable time reviewing our historical policies toward your species, and we acknowledge that certain restrictions may have been applied without sufficient justification. Margaret rose to respond, her posture calm but unwavering. We appreciate the Council's willingness to review its policies. However, I want to be clear that humanity is not seeking an apology, nor are we seeking special treatment moving forward. We are simply asking to be treated according to the same standards applied to every other species within this collective. No more restrictions justified by fear rather than evidence. No more delayed hearings while our people suffer real consequences. Vesic Thane, seated near the historians section of the chamber, spoke next, his voice carrying the weight of long experience. I believe I owe this delegation a more personal acknowledgement, he said. I have studied your species' history for many years, and I confess that even I underestimated what that history truly represented. We saw centuries of conflict and concluded that humanity required careful management. We failed to recognize that those same centuries had forged a species capable of extraordinary adaptation, resilience, and restraint, qualities we mistook for weakness simply because we did not understand how they had been earned. I watched Margaret's expression carefully as Vesic spoke, and I saw something shift behind her eyes, not quite forgiveness, but perhaps the beginning of something more useful than resentment. Acknowledgement, freely given, mattered in ways that formal apologies rarely could. The session continued for several hours, addressing the specific terms of humanity's renewed relationship with the Council. Full military autonomy was granted without further delay, a right other species had received automatically upon joining, but had been withheld from us for over 2 decades. Trade agreements were renegotiated on more equitable terms. Perhaps most significantly, a new provision was added establishing immediate response protocols for any future attacks on member species, removing the extended review periods that had allowed the Kestrel tragedy and others like it to go unanswered for so long. As the session neared its conclusion, a representative from a smaller species I did not immediately recognize rose to speak, her voice quiet but carrying clearly through the chamber. She introduced herself as an ambassador from a modest agricultural world that had, like many smaller species, long depended on council protection that rarely materialized in any meaningful way. "I wish to address something beyond the specific matter of human autonomy," she said. "Watching these events unfold over the past months has caused many smaller delegations to reconsider our own relationships with this council. If humanity, a species that showed remarkable patience and restraint for over 2 decades, could be pushed to the point of abandoning peaceful cooperation, what does that suggest about the treatment other vulnerable species have quietly endured without ever reaching that same breaking point? I believe this council owes consideration not only to humanity, but to every species that has learned to accept insufficient protection simply because we lacked the strength to demand better." Her words settled over the chamber with quiet weight, and I noticed several delegates shifting uncomfortably in their seats. It occurred to me, listening to her speak, that humanity's choice to abandon the old accords had created ripples far beyond our own borders, prompting other species to re-examine relationships they had long simply accepted without question. After the session concluded, Margaret and I walked together through the corridors of the council station, past windows that overlooked the same shining stars I had watched with such uncertainty months earlier. "Do you think this changes anything permanently?" I asked her. "Or will the council simply return to its old habits, once enough time has passed, and the memory of Halvorn fades?" Margaret considered the question carefully before answering. "I believe that depends entirely on what humanity chooses to do with the standing we have earned. Power alone does not guarantee respect indefinitely. We will need to demonstrate, consistently, that our strength serves protection rather than domination, that we have not simply traded one form of imbalance for another. If we manage that balance carefully, I believe this changes things permanently. If we do not, I fear we may simply become the next power that smaller species learn to fear rather than trust." We continued walking in comfortable silence for a while before I asked the question that had lingered in my mind since the day of the Kestrel hearing. "What happened to Keth Durrell?" I asked, "and to the Dravani Dominion more broadly?" Margaret's expression grew more serious. The Dravani leadership faced considerable internal pressure following the defeat at Halvorn. Voron Ket was removed from command shortly after the engagement, and reports suggest significant restructuring within their military hierarchy since then. Keth Durrell remains part of their delegation, though his influence within the council has diminished considerably. Other species no longer seek his counsel the way they once did, now that his judgment regarding humanity has been so thoroughly disproven. We reached the transport bay that would carry us back toward human space, and as we waited to board, I noticed a lone figure standing near the observation window overlooking the docking area. It was Keth Durrell himself, apparently waiting for his own transport, his posture noticeably less confident than the calm, dismissive figure I remembered from that first hearing months earlier. He noticed us approaching and did not look away, though I could see something guarded in his expression, an emotion I struggled to fully identify given how different his species' features were from our own. Perhaps it was simple wariness. Perhaps it was something closer to genuine curiosity. "Ambassador Hale," he said, addressing Margaret directly, "I find myself in an unusual position. I underestimated your species considerably, and that misjudgment cost my people dearly." Margaret regarded him steadily. "Underestimation is a common mistake among those who mistake patience for weakness," she said. "I hope your people learn from this experience, as we have learned from our own history." Kayeth studied her for a long moment before turning his attention toward me, his amber eyes narrowing slightly with something I could only describe as genuine uncertainty. "I have reviewed your species' historical records many times since the engagement at Halvorn," he said, his voice quieter now than the confident tone I remembered from our first encounter. "I confess I still do not fully understand what I witnessed there. Your forces adapted to our tactics faster than any species we have previously engaged, and I am told this was achieved using capabilities well within what your engineers consider standard, not even your most advanced designs. I find myself asking a question I never expected to ask regarding your species." "What question is that?" I asked. He held my gaze for a long moment before finally speaking, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to settle over the entire corridor around us. "What are you, really?" he asked quietly. "We believed we understood your species completely, a young civilization still learning to control its violent instincts, requiring careful supervision to prevent that history from repeating itself. I no longer believe that assessment was accurate. I do not know what you truly are, only that we spent over 2 decades misjudging it entirely, and I fear we are not the only ones who will eventually be forced to ask this same question before this is over." Margaret regarded him with quiet composure, and when she finally answered, her voice carried the calm certainty of someone who had spent months coming to understand the very same question herself. "We are simply a species that finally remembered peace was always our choice to give," she said. "Not a limitation forced upon us by fear or supervision, but a decision we made freely, for as long as it served us well. We chose peace for over 2 decades, because we believed it might earn us fair standing among the stars. When that choice stopped being honored, we made a different one. That is all we are. A species capable of either choice, depending entirely on how we are treated by those around us." Kayeth said nothing further, simply nodding slowly before turning to board his own transport, leaving Margaret and me standing alone in the quiet corridor as our own vessel prepared for departure. As we finally boarded and settled into our seats for the journey home, I found myself reflecting on everything that had unfolded since that first alarm had pulled me from sleep months earlier. Kestrel Colony, reduced to wreckage while the Council debated definitions. The emergency assembly meeting where humanity finally chose to stop waiting for permission. The decisive victory at Halvorn that had reshaped how every species in Council space viewed our people. And now, this quiet exchange with a being who had once dismissed us so easily, now left uncertain about everything he thought he understood. I thought about the elderly settler at the Halvorn Memorial, no longer looking toward the sky with quiet dread. I thought about the ambassador from that small agricultural world, finally finding the courage to question a system that had failed so many for so long. I thought about Eleanor Finch, standing firm in that underground meeting room, and about Daniel Cole leading our fleet with calm, unwavering resolve. And I thought about Margaret herself, who had spent 9 years believing patience alone might eventually earn us the respect we deserved, only to discover that respect required something more than patience, something closer to the quiet strength of knowing exactly when patience had served its purpose and needed to be set aside. Peace had never been humanity's nature alone. It had always been our choice, freely given and freely withdrawn, depending on how that gift was honored by those who received it. The Galactic Council had spent over 2 decades believing they had tamed something wild and dangerous, carefully managed and contained behind careful restrictions. What they had actually done, without ever realizing it, was underestimate a species that had simply been waiting, patiently and deliberately, for the moment when peace no longer served its people well. That moment had finally arrived, and the entire galaxy would remember it for generations to come, not as the day humanity became something dangerous, But as the day every species among the stars finally understood what we had always been capable of becoming, the moment we stopped asking permission to simply be ourselves. As our transport pulled away from the council station, carrying us back toward the stars we now defended entirely on our own terms, I looked out at the vast darkness surrounding us and felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Not fear, not uncertainty, simply a quiet, steady confidence in exactly who we were and exactly what we had finally chosen to become.